Hello, it is January reading wrap-up time. A little late, but that's okay. As you can see from my nice little sign over here that I used to keep track of my reading, I had a very good reading month in January, so be forewarned, this video might get a little on the longer side because I do have 12 books to talk about, and also brief warning, it'll be the second half of the books that I talk about, but I did read the entire Game Changer series in January, so I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on all 6 of those books. So that will be coming towards the end of the video. But without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. As always, if you'd like to see more stats-based stuff, I do a whole stats page in my reading journal, so I'll set that all up and talk about kind of the stats and the breakdown of all of the different books that I read in that video. This one's just going to be more rambling thoughts of my thoughts on all of the books, so let's get into it. The first book that I finished in January was actually a book that I started back in October. I finally finished Slewfoot. It's technically published under horror, but I don't know that I 100% agree with that categorization. I think it is more of a fantasy book that has horror elements in it than it is like a true horror book, but that's just my personal opinion. But technically a horror book, so that's why I started reading it in October, and I wanted to read this book for a really long time, and it kind of just like fell flat for me. I don't know, I didn't hate it, but it wasn't my favorite thing ever. I think I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. Yeah, I gave it 2.5 stars, which is like my very strictly in the middle of the road rating. I had like no positive or negative thoughts about it as a whole. I think it was kind of like cliche and played out in the aspects of feminine rage that it did. I also found it very strange that all of the like fantasy and witch elements, because this takes place in like puritanical New England, so it's very colonial and all that in that time period, but it takes a much more like Old English, Scottish, Irish witch kind of vibe instead of, I think, leaning into probably what would be more true to the time period of looking at things through an indigenous lens, which I, first of all, don't think the author is the right person to do that, but I do think that it's weird to set something in colonial New England and not really discuss that at all. Like, it's mentioned very briefly, and there's indigenous Native American characters in the book that are like very minor side characters that just make an appearance, but I think it was just, I kept like being like, this feels incorrect. Like the understanding of the natural world doesn't vibe with the setting at all. So I think this book would have worked better for me if it had been more centered on like the witch hunts in England than in America. That was my first like thing, because a lot of the witchy aspects of this are very like nature based and not talking about any of the ways that indigenous culture treats nature was a strange choice to me, especially because the other main character besides our like main witch character Agatha is like a nature creature who has existed in North America for centuries. So him also only very vaguely talking about how non-white people saw him was strange. So that was a little bit strange for me. And then it just like felt uninspired generally. It felt pretty like run-of-the-mill witch vibes for the entirety of the book. I think that the beginning was a little bit interesting in the way that the story was set up, but I think most of the middle of the book felt very like boring and not super interesting to me, and felt like something that I had read or seen before. As someone who consumes a lot of horror witch kind of media, it didn't feel unique to me very much at all for the majority of the story, with the exception of the ending is kind of a little bit unique, but I think for the majority of the story it just wasn't super unique. I didn't find the writing like super great. It was just fine. And I think that the characters didn't have a ton of character growth. Our main character kind of just gets angrier as the book goes on, which is understandable, but there isn't any character development besides that. So yeah, it was fine. I didn't hate it, but I just felt like it was missing a lot of stuff that could have been written about if it was written by a different person. So that's my thoughts on Slewfoot. It did take me like 2.5 months to read, just because I had it in physical format, and that is kind of my slowest reading format usually. It's hard for me sometimes to convince myself to like sit down and pick up a physical book, but that, and then it was also over the holidays, and I just generally found it interesting for the most part. So that is my thoughts on Slewfoot. Next up, we have Release Me, which is the third book in the New Haven series. It's one of those like disconnected, interconnected romance series. You know what I'm talking about. And I read the collectively 3 books that make up the second installment in the series. So very weird. You can watch my December wrap up if you want to know more of my thoughts on that. But that's kind of a weird situation in and of itself. But this third book is just one book, and it is entirely one installment. So I read that, and I also ended up reading the 4th book in this series as well. It wasn't the next book that I read. I read 2 books in between them. But generally, my thoughts of this series are the first book is the best book, and it has like progressively gotten worse as it's gone on. This book I ended up rating 3 stars. I thought that some of the character choices and the themes it was discussing were really interesting, but this book had a really weird situation. I guess I should explain like what the romance setup of this is. One of the characters, the FMC, is a previous sex worker, and she's kind of escaping her like abusive pimp basically. And then the MMC is like a CEO of a huge bunch of businesses in the New Haven town, which is a fictional town. But him and his family like own a bunch of businesses and investments around the town. So he's like inherited wealth CEO guy. And she applies for a job at the hotel that he owns and created. So she starts working there, and that's how they first interact. But I think this had a really weird situation where the characters themselves were like playing against a lot of gender stereotypes and stuff, like the way that they talked about themselves and each other, and the ways that they like interacted with each other was really sweet and beautiful. But the plot like forced them into very specific gender roles, which I didn't appreciate, and I just thought it was a very weird contradiction that the characters themselves and the relationship itself wasn't built on those gender roles, but the plot itself kind of like forced them to participate in these weird gender roles, and I didn't really love that. And then I also just found the third act of this book to be entirely unbelievable in the way that it played out. I had to suspend my disbelief quite a lot in order to believe that the end of this book even could happen, with the way that the whole setup was fine, like of what the problem was in the third act, but the way that it played out was very unbelievable to me. So that's why I ended up giving it 3 stars. Like I said, I think the first book in this series has been my favorite, and I thought it was the most like sweet and beautiful, and I thought the themes were really good. And like I said, I think the themes were pretty interesting in this one, but I just think the way that the plot was set up kind of like detracted from the themes and from the characters themselves, which was like a really weird dichotomy between the characters and themes and the plot itself. So yeah, kind of like unsure, but a little bit more on the positive side for that one. Next up is a reread. I reread The Love Hypothesis because the movie's coming out this summer, and I'd put this on hold at the library in like October, and it just finally came in. So I was like, I'll speed through this really quick. I won't need to like pay too much attention since I'm rereading it. I did reread it like right when I was really getting back into reading. I didn't really ever have like a full break in reading like a lot of people do. Like I kind of stopped in high school, but I was still reading like a lot of fan fiction and stuff like that, even though I wasn't reading like published literature. I never really stopped reading, but this was like right when I was getting back into reading more heavily because I graduated college, and I had more free time. But so I really loved this the first time that I read it, and then everyone kind of like dogged on it in all of the years since. And so I was like, maybe I'll reread this and I won't really like it as much, but I did still really enjoy it. I think it is a really great book. I like the characters a lot. I didn't end up re-rating it. I gave it 4.5 stars the first time I read it, and I didn't have enough of a differing opinion that I felt like I needed to re-rate it. So that's my like quick little spiel on that. My one thing that I definitely noticed a lot more this time reading it is the insane amount of references to their difference in size. Even though our MC Olive is supposed to be like over average height, there is so much talk of how much huger and bigger Adam is than her, which is an interesting choice. I don't know that I love it, but that's not usually something that I get super hung up on, even though I do think it's a stupid character choice, or a stupid writing choice, I guess, for that to be like such a focal point in a relationship. I think it's weird, but I'm not super hung up on it. I know it like really, really bothers some people. So if that's something that really bothers you, maybe don't read this one, because it is kind of a lot. And the one other thing is, I don't really love the like way that her being like she's a grad student in this book. And so I don't really love the way that her like being portrayed as like a struggling grad student is done all the time, because a lot of the time it like focuses a lot on the way that it's affecting her body, and I don't love that. I think there's a lot better ways that you can describe how it feels to be a struggling grad student than be like, oh, I am underweight and malnourished. So I didn't love that part either, but those two things like aren't really enough for me to have a huge issue with this book and make me go through rewriting it. So I just kept the same rating, but I definitely was a little bit more critical of it on the reread as I've read more and kind of developed my critical analysis skills more of books. But since that was a reread, that's all I'm going to talk about, The Love Hypothesis. Next up was possibly one of my favorite books of the month, and that is The Princess Knight by Kate Jacobs. This was so sweet and cute and beautiful, and it had a lot more fantasy in it than I was expecting. The setup of this is kind of Legally Blonde-esque. Our main character, Clea, she is a princess to a kingdom, and she's kind of unofficially betrothed to the prince of another kingdom. And he and his captain of the guard and his like retinue are coming to her kingdom, and kind of the expectation of her and her parents and like all of the people that are their advisors and stuff is that they've kind of been unofficially betrothed up to this point, and he's going to like officially propose, and they're going to be engaged and join their kingdoms and everything. But when the prince shows up, he actually breaks things off with her and goes to this really prestigious knight college, basically. It's like a college where you get trained to fight and lead and be a really, really good fighter and knight and all this stuff. And he is a pretty skilled like fighter and swordsman, and his captain of the guard is very, very skilled. So he kind of unexpectedly and without really warning anyone does this and goes off to the college. And so Clea has the grand idea that if she can prove to him that she can be a warrior queen like he's saying his kingdom needs by going to this college and training and getting really good at it, that she can win him back. She's not really in love with him at all. That's pretty clearly established. They kind of just see each other as friends that kind of have these roles that they need to fulfill for their kingdoms. But her parents are really set on this marriage, and she feels like she needs to do it for her kingdom. There is possibly an impending war, and she thinks that her kingdom isn't the most war-driven. They don't have the best fighters. They're not have a good army. So she kind of feels like she needs to marry him so that they can have kind of the protection of the other kingdom if war is to come upon the continent that they are in. So she goes off to this college, and things proceed from there. There's lots of like spy stuff, and this had a lot more fantasy world building than I was expecting. When I initially read the synopsis, I was kind of expecting this to be much more like in the vein of romantasy, where the romance is fully the forefront and the fantasy is kind of just the background setting. But I would say this is a pretty equally split romantasy, where the romance is integral to the plot, but the fantasy elements and the like politics of the world and all of that kind of stuff are just as important, if not more important, to the plot. So that was a very pleasant surprise for me. I really, really loved the world building that was done here, and the characters, all of them, no matter if you love them or hate them, go on so much of a journey and have so much character growth throughout this book. And I just thought it was really beautifully done. This is pretty solidly what I would describe as new adult, even though this is published as adult. The author has said that they originally wrote it as young adult, so young adults can read it, and they are all the characters like 18 to 20-ish age range, so that is pretty solidly what I describe as new adult. And it also deals a lot with like coming of age and coming into your own person and figuring out how to stay true to yourself while also like doing the best thing for the people around you. So I just really, really loved it. I thought that the romance in this was really, really sweet and beautifully done. And I again thought that the fantasy elements were surprising to me, really well done, and really important to the story. So I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. My only pretty minor critique was that this is technically a standalone. Like, the author has said that this is a standalone, but there was quite a lot of loose threads by the end of the story that I feel like there's no way that this is going to stay a standalone. And that is my like one minor gripe with it, is like I wish that it either had wrapped all of those up and was truly a standalone, or that it would have been announced when this was published that like this is like kind of a standalone, whereas the main plot is all wrapped up in this book, but there is more to explore in the world, essentially. So that was kind of my like one nitpick of it that kept it from being a 5-star read for me, was just there were quite a lot of things that were left unfinished in some of the more minor plots of the book. So that is The Princess Knight. Next up was Reclaim Me, which is the last published book of the New Haven series, and I think this is probably where I'm going to discontinue the series because I did not like this book at all. I guess that's not really fair to say. I thought it was middle of the road. I gave it 2.5 stars, so I didn't like hate it, but it was definitely my least favorite of the series, and I had the most issues with it. This is a second chance romance, which I find pretty hard to do if you don't set it up really well, and this was not set up well in my opinion. The two main characters, the FMC and the MMC, they were together for a really long time, and the MMC deals with addiction and had a relapse, and the FMC finds out that she's pregnant at the same time that this happens and leaves, and he doesn't know that she has a kid. And she comes back like 10 years later with her new boyfriend and his mom. I don't know why she's in this story. His mom is real dumb. But she moves back to the town with them, and they run into each other, and she has to tell him like, hey, this is your daughter. And so he wants a relationship with his daughter, and they kind of like rekindle their flame. My really big issue with this story is that the FMC does cheat on her boyfriend. That's like very obvious. The first chapter is literally like her actively cheating on him, and then you flash back to see how they got to that point. But I don't think there's a strong enough case for her to be cheating on her boyfriend. Like, he is kind of a piece of shit. He's not the greatest boyfriend. He is pretty selfish and does things for himself, but like, he's not abusive or manipulative. He's not like keeping her trapped in this relationship. She could break up with him at any time with little to no consequence. And instead she like chooses to cheat on him and then go back and get engaged. Like, it's a very weird thing. And I don't know, this author has like a weird thing with cheating. There's also like quite a lot of it in the second installment in this series. And that one I found more okay because it's kind of like an arranged, forced, manipulated into marriage kind of a situation, where it's like more understandable, I guess, but this one just felt like she is choosing to be in this relationship and also choosing to cheat on him. So that was a really weird choice to me. And I thought that it weakened both of the characters and their relationship quite a lot. And I also think the situation that instigates the MMC, like relapsing, is very complicated. And also, I'm not going to say it's like the FMC's fault at all, because he like still is the one who chose to do that, and he should be able to like keep that managed himself. But the situation that he's in that then leads him to doing that, the fact that he's in that situation alone is the FMC's fault, and she never apologizes for that, and they kind of treat it as like it's only his failing for relapsing, but it's not also her failing for like putting him in this really horrible situation. Like, even if he didn't relapse, I still think that she needed to apologize to him for making him go through that situation alone. I'm trying to be like as vague as possible without giving any spoilers or anything, but yeah, like the situation that he's in and is having a really hard time with, and she like knows that he's having a really hard time with it, and she's also having like kind of a hard time with it, but she's able to like fully distance herself from the situation, and he does not have the ability to do the same. And it is a situation that she should be pretty heavily involved in, and she chooses not to be. And like the way that it affects his mental health is pretty detrimental, and she never really apologizes for forcing him to go through that situation alone, regardless of the outcome of what happens at the end of that situation. So like he apologizes for making her like witness what he does after that, but she never apologizes for like kind of helping put him in that situation, if that makes sense. So I didn't really like that like all of the blame was on him for their relationship ending the first time, when I don't think that the blame was actually all on him, and probably about half the blame is actually on her. So I had a pretty big issue with the imbalance of accountability there, and then also just the entire setup of the second renewal of their relationship was quite off-putting to me. So I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. I did think that the things that were written well, their relationship was pretty good if you removed like the cheating aspect of it. And I thought that the explorations, especially from the MMC's side of the ways that he experiences grief and the way that he has like figured out how to deal with that and deal with it without turning to addiction, was pretty well done. And I also thought that the kid was written really well. She was quite a funny character and felt like a full character and not just a little kid plot device. So those were the things I liked about it. But yes, I did have quite a few issues with this book. And then I'm going to go slightly out of order, because technically the next book that I read was Game Changer, which is the first book in the Game Changer series, and I have to talk about all 6 of those. So first I'm going to talk about the third to last book that I read, which is The Center. I went into this thinking that it was a horror book, and it is actually a literary fiction book, and I think it would have been better as a horror book. This is a book about this mysterious place called The Center, where you can learn a new language in 10 days. And no one really knows how they do it. It's very secretive. You have to be invited by someone who's already a member. When you're a member, you can only invite a single person in your entire life to be a part of the center. So you have to be really like strict about who you choose to use your invite on. And it's very secretive. They make you like sign a bunch of NDAs, and you have to do all of this stuff to even be a part of it. And our main character is a translator. That's what she does for a living. And she's having like a hard time getting jobs. She really wants to be a book translator. And so far she's kind of just been translating like books that she doesn't really care about. And so her boyfriend has gone to the center, and he kind of ends up telling her about it and is like, hey, I'm going to use my one invite on you. And she goes and learns a couple of different languages, and each time her experience is a little different, and she learns a little more about the center, and she ends up finding, how they're actually doing this, and it is kind of crazy, which is part of why I think this would have been better as a horror book than as literary fiction. And I thought that the premise was really interesting, and I thought the writing was generally really good, but the author and the main character both are from privileged backgrounds class-wise, and that is very apparent in the story and the way that the story concludes, in my opinion. The ending of this book kind of ruined a lot of the theme work that the book had done up to the end for me. I think that the themes are quite interesting of discussing. This has a lot of taking advantage of poorer, lower class people in it, and I think that those discussions were really interesting of when is it okay to do that, and why is it not okay to do that, and that kind of stuff, and how upper class people kind of see that. But I think that the conclusion that this book came to at the end, and the way that the main character decides to act on all of the information that she's discovered throughout this book, kind of ruined all of the theme work that had been done up to the end of the book. I feel like she kind of comes to the conclusion that is the opposite of what I wanted her to conclude. And so that ruined a lot of the discussions that were had for me. But yeah, I thought it was interesting up to the end. I find translation a very interesting topic. I just think it's so interesting that you can never translate anything perfectly between languages. And it's quite hard to learn a new language if you don't learn languages growing up, and the loss of language that you can experience even if you grew up with a language and you're not speaking it as an adult. I just find language and translation very interesting topics, so I thought that I would really love this book, and I did find the setup quite interesting, but I think just the execution of the latter half of this book really was not what I expected it to be, and kind of ruined some of the theme work for me personally. So that is my thoughts on the center. And with that being said, we're now going to go through all of 6 of the Game Changer books. So if you don't want to hear my thoughts on all 6 of those, you can feel free to skip to my February TBR. I'll put the chapters and everything like usual. But I'm not quite sure how I'm going to talk about these yet. I feel like maybe I'll go through my thoughts on each of them individually, and then at the end I'll do a little ranking of how I liked all of them compared against each other, because I think it's kind of hard to talk about these books individually since they're so intertwined with each other. But obviously, like everyone else in the world, I watched Heated Rivalry in December, and pretty immediately, I think after I watched episode 4, I put all of the books on hold, and they all ended up coming in January, which was really nice. My library acquired 70 new copies of each book, which is kind of insane, because otherwise they wouldn't have come in until the end of February, but they came in January, so I was like, oh, I need to read these all, because they also came in a weird order. They came in the 4th one came in first, and then I got The Long Game before I got Heated Rivalry, and so I had to wait for them all to come in so I could read them, and by the time that the first one came in, I only had 10 days or something to read all 6, so I plowed through these. But first up, the first book in the series, Game Changer, Kip and Scott's story. I ended up giving this 3 stars. I do think the relationship is quite sweet in this book. I do like the relationship that develops between these two and everything, but I just have to say the writing in this book is atrocious. I think in general, all of the books, the writing style is not super my taste. It's fine for the most part in most of the books, but the writing in this first book is much worse than the rest of the series. You can definitely tell that this was the first book that Rachel Reid published. But if you are reading the first book and you're like, oh my god, the writing is awful, it does get better after the first book, I promise, because I definitely noticed it in this first book, and it kind of detracted from me being able to immerse myself in the story in this first book, but it didn't do that for any of the rest of the books. So that's what I'll say about the writing in general. My other issue with this book was how short the timeline is. They do spread this timeline out a lot in the show, which I do think that is a weird choice to make this whole relationship be spread out over like 3 years, but in the book it is like 4 months or 6 months or something from start to finish, from them first meeting in the smoothie shop to them kissing on the ice in front of the whole world. So that's kind of crazy to me, especially with the way that Kip acts in the book versus how he acts in the show. The show makes it seem much more like Scott is just paranoid and he like has a lot of fears because of how hockey culture talks about gay men, but that none of that stuff is really like happening around him all the time, and that people aren't like as aware of who he is as a public figure. In the book, it is much more like Kip is kind of asking a lot of Scott when he's like, I can't be in a relationship with someone who's closeted, after he's already in the relationship. So that was a little bit weird for me. I think it detracted from Kip's character in the book a little bit, but I think it does make Scott seem like a more likable character. It is quite an interesting dichotomy between the book and the show, because in the show, Scott is kind of like, I mean, I guess in the book too, he is definitely like driven by his fear of coming out and being open about who he is. But in the book, I think that fear is more justified by the plot and kind of outside forces that are happening. And in the show, while you still do like agree that Scott has a right to be afraid and he can be afraid of that, especially considering, you know, hockey culture and everything like that, there is more of a case of like, he is kind of a little too afraid, but I don't think it's portrayed that way as much in the book. So it was very interesting reading this book after watching the show and being like, oh, that's interesting that they decided to change things up that way. So in general, I think I liked the romance and I like the characters. I do think Kip is a little unreasonable in him pushing so hard in such a short timeline. I do think the book would have benefited from being a little bit more stretched out timeline wise, and it would have made both of the characters more sympathetic. I definitely felt more sympathy for Scott in the book versus Kip, whereas in the show I felt more sympathetic towards both characters. So that's my thoughts on that one. I don't really have a ton to say besides that, since this one is included in the show, and I feel a lot of people know the romance that happens in this. I guess I never really described the book in case you haven't watched the show. Yeah, Scott is a hockey player in the MHL in the book. And Kip is just works at a smoothie shop, and Scott comes in one day, gets a smoothie, and then plays a really, really good game. And so he keeps coming in because he's like, if this smoothie made me play better, and he's in a really like big rut in his hockey life, then he is going to keep going to the smoothie shop. And it doesn't suck that the guy making his smoothies is really hot and he's really into him. So that's the kind of the setup of the story. So yeah, that is my thoughts on Game Changer. Not anything too like profound, just pretty good. The writing is kind of bad, but it's a good intro into the world and the setup of all of these gay characters that are to follow. So then, you know, next up obviously is Heated Rivalry. That is the main love of everyone's lives. The like character favorites. This is about two rival hockey players who have a situationship that spans over 10 years, included in this book. And it was great. I loved it. I don't really have a ton to say. The characters are really well done. Again, Rachel Reid's writing is like fine. It's middle of the road. It's definitely not as bad in this book. The first book, I just think the writing is atrocious. But if you can get past that first book, the writing is like pretty just like mediocre, middle of the road. It's not bad to the point that it's distracting from the story, but it's also not really adding anything to the books, in my opinion, for kind of the rest of the books in the series. But this is definitely Rachel Reid's finest character work is in Heated Rivalry. There's so much that these characters are dealing with, and the ways that they are explored is really great. I love that we get to see them over the course of 10 years, kind of figuring out who they are, but also who they are to each other. And I just think it's a great story, and it's very beautifully done. And I love the characters, and I love the character development and everything. And I'm not going to say anything profound about this. Like, it's great. There's a reason that it was adapted into a TV show that the entire world is obsessing over and losing their minds over. Yeah, I'm excited for season 2, especially after reading The Long Game. Okay, next up is Tough Guy. This is the third book in the series, obviously, and this follows Orion Price, who is the enforcer for a bunch of different teams. He's been traded a lot. He gets traded to teams that have like problem players so that he can protect them and all that stuff. And at the beginning of this book, he gets traded to Toronto, and he's like having a pretty hard time in general. He has anxiety, and he had kind of like a panic attack at the end of the last season before he gets traded. And he is just generally having like a pretty hard time finding his love of hockey anymore. He hates being an enforcer. He hates like beating people up all the time. He is a really like soft and gentle person off the ice, so he has a really hard time like reconciling these two parts of himself, and he's kind of just like on autopilot through life. He doesn't really like find joy in anything, and he's just having a hard time with like his professional career in general. And he's like, I love hockey, but I hate hockey culture, and I hate the role that I'm being forced to play in hockey right now. And so that's kind of how he is at the start of the story. And he walks into a drugstore, and he sees Fabian, who he knows from childhood. Ryan stayed at his family's house, and they both had a crush on each other, but neither of them knew. They almost kissed one time, but that did not happen. So they kind of reconnect at the beginning of this book and start hanging out. And, they very obviously still like each other and have a crush on each other, but there's a lot of different like dynamics at play at the beginning of the book of them not really being sure if the other person likes them. Ryan has a pretty low self-confidence in the beginning of the book, and so he's like, there's no way that Fabian likes me. Fabian's perfect, angel, beautiful, hot, sexy, and Fabian's like, even if Ryan's gay, there's no way that he likes me. Fabian is very like femme and very like visibly openly queer. And so he's like, even if Ryan is into men, there's no way that he likes me because of the way that I am. Scott is at this point in time the only out hockey player. Ryan is kind of like softly out. Like if people ask him if he's gay, he'll tell them. But he didn't do like a big public thing. But Scott is like the really big open person, and his boyfriend is not femme. He's pretty masked. So Fabian's like, there's no way that even if Ryan is into men that he's gonna like me. So that's kind of the dynamic at the beginning. And I have a hard time with this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars overall, but I like the idea, and I like a lot of the execution of the characters individually, but I think that the way that the relationship is developed, especially towards the end, I had a lot of issues with. I think, first of all, I'm just going to get this out of the way. A lot of people don't like Fabian because he doesn't like hockey. I think that is an unfair criticism to have. Fabian has lived with hockey players for the majority of his life, and his older sister, I think, is a professional hockey player, and his parents wanted him to play hockey, and they're always talking about hockey, and he's been immersed in hockey culture. He knows exactly like how bad hockey culture can be, especially to someone like him who is very openly queer and is femme and has all of these things about him that are like hockey culture can very easily be horrible about. So he has a very justified reason for disliking hockey, and every hockey player that he's interacted with besides Ryan has been horrible to him. Like, Ryan is the one exception. So saying that he should like change his entire opinion about hockey because of Ryan is kind of crazy. I think that's an unfair criticism to have of him, and I don't think that he needs to change that. I think he can say, like, I don't like hockey in general, but I think that there are good people who play hockey. Like, that is a thing that you can say. Like, that's an unfair criticism, in my opinion, of Fabian. So that's my one thing out of the way. But with that being said, the third act breakup was not handled super well, in my opinion, in regards to Ryan's anxiety. So that's my big issue with the book, is that because I think Rachel Reid thought that she needed to have a third act breakup, because there are a couple books where the third act breakup feels very forced, and then it doesn't happen in the last two books at all. So I think that it was just like something that she felt like she needed to have in order to have conflict in the story. But I actually think it would have been better if they didn't have like a breakup or a separation at all. Because I think it just would have, I think it's very out of character for the way that Fabian acts about Ryan. Like, he can very clearly tell that hockey is upsetting Ryan and it is hurting his mental health a lot. But I think instead of like being understanding and caring the way that Fabian has been shown to be, he's kind of like just pushes Ryan to the side. Like, if you're going to keep playing hockey, then you have to figure this out by yourself. And I just don't really think that is, first of all, how Fabian would have reacted to that based on everything that we know of him prior to when that happens. And I also think that's not a great way to show someone kind of caring for someone that has such severe anxiety that Ryan does. So that was my like big issue with the book, is I think the third act breakup ruins a lot of the character development and like makes me feel like they aren't compatible just in the ways that they need to deal with things. So like that was just really hard for me. Like, I understand it's a trope, so it like, I think Rachel Reid thought that it had to happen, and that was the only way to introduce conflict into your story, and she realized in later books that that's not true. But I think at this point in time she thought that was like the only way to introduce a good conflict into the end of your story. And so that was my like big issue with the book, was just the way that the third act breakup made me change how I felt about the characters, and also changed how I felt about their relationship in general. So I ended up giving this 3 stars. Like I said, I think what Rachel Reid was attempting to do with this book, with dealing with like both of the characters aren't as immersed in hockey culture. You know, Ryan is kind of like dealing with kind of growing to hate and resent hockey, and Fabian is someone who very openly hates and resents hockey and thinks that hockey culture is horrible, justifiably. I think that's an interesting concept of having these two characters be together and kind of navigating that while Ryan is still trying to figure out if he can still have a love of hockey throughout the book. Like, I like what she was attempting, but I think just the execution of like the second half of the book wasn't super strong and made me have a lot of doubts about the relationship in general. So that's my thoughts on Tough Guy. I don't know if I said I ended up giving it 3 stars, which again isn't bad in my book. It's just towards the lower end of something that I enjoyed. Next up, we have Common Goal, which is between Eric, who is a goaltender, and he is playing his last season, but he hasn't told anyone that he's going to be retiring. He went through a divorce a couple of years earlier. He was with his wife for his entire career. And so he's like, do I know how to play hockey without her? Like, I feel like I have lost my spark a little bit in hockey. And he's also very aware of like the physical and mental toll that hockey takes on your body. And he's like, I would rather retire before things get so bad that I can't come back from it. He's like, I could technically play like another season or two, but it would be so detrimental to my physical and mental health that I don't want to do that. And I would rather retire before I get to that point. So that's kind of him. And then Kyle is much younger. He's 24, I think, and Eric is 40. So they have a pretty big age gap. And Kyle is a bartender and an art student. And so that is where they kick off. Kyle is also in the first book. He has a bit of a crush on Kip, but that is never going to happen. And Eric is bi, but he has been with his wife for so long that he's never like experienced being with another man, even though he does know that he's bi. So the whole like premise of their relationship at the beginning is them kind of being like, oh, hey, Kyle, will you teach me how to approach men and date men? Because like I want to explore that side of myself more. But they have this big glaring issue of the age gap. And Eric is like, I really don't want to take advantage of this guy, even though I think he's really great. And Kyle has had a previous relationship with someone that was much older when he was 18. And it ended really, really badly. And it was pretty grooming-esque. But so Eric is conscious of that as well. But that is kind of the whole conflict of the book, is the age gap. And I think at a certain point I was like, Eric, you either need to shut up and get over it or like stop talking to him. Like it just went on for a really long time of that being their only conflict, was Eric being like, you're too young for me, and Kyle being like, I'm not too young for you, I can make my own choices. And then them being like, okay, fine, we can keep hooking up, but we're not going to be in a relationship. Like that was the whole conflict for the whole book. So it was quite repetitive, and at the end I was kind of just like, you guys need to get over yourselves, basically. Mostly from Eric's side of he needs to get over it and move on, or he needs to stop caring. Like he needs to get over it and move on, or he needs to stop doing it. Like that's the two options, and he doesn't take either of those options for the entire book. So by the end I was kind of just like frustrated and fed up with it. I do also think that their relationship is the most boring in and of itself. I do like the beginning kind of like exploration of Eric being like, hey, so I 100% know that I'm bi. Like even though I've never been with a man, I know that I'm bi. Like that is not something that I'm questioning or coming to terms with at all. But I don't know how to in general approach relationships, but also specifically approach relationships with men, because I was married and in a relationship for like my entire adult life, basically. So I thought that was quite interesting, but that exploration is kind of over by the first like third of the book. So besides that, I found their relationship dynamic to be just quite a typical relationship dynamic. There wasn't really anything super interesting or romantic or profound about their relationship, in my opinion. So it was definitely like the most boring of the books, I think, but I think for the most part it handled stuff well. So I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. It was fine. It was good, fine, whatever. I would say it's pretty on par with Game Changer, in my opinion, like as far as the relationship dynamic and everything, but the writing's a little bit better in this one, because the writing in the first one is awful, like I said. So that's why it's a little higher rated, but still, about the same kind of stuff. 2 more books to go. Next up is Role Model, which I ended up giving 4.5 stars. This is about Troy. He played with Ryan for the last season that Ryan was playing hockey, and he was friends with this really shitty guy named Dallas Kent. And it comes out that Dallas, a bunch of women come forward and are like, hey, this guy is sexually assaulted me. And so Troy like kind of takes his rose-colored glasses off and is like, yeah, so you're a piece of shit, and like yells at him during practice one day, and it gets recorded and uploaded, and kind of his entire team and the entire NHL turn on him because, as we've seen, they're very protective of the players even when they're doing horrible things. And so Dallas is like a star player, and so the entire league and every all the hockey fans are like protecting him and rallying behind him and saying that all of these women are just making things up and that Troy is believing random people over someone that he's played with for years and his best friend. So Troy gets traded to the Centaurs, which is the Ottawa team, and they are the team that Ilya is playing for now after the end of Heated Rivalry. So this one has the most crossover with Ilya and Shane. Ilya does pop up in all of the books. He's collecting queer hockey players like the Infinity Stones, but this is the book that he's the most prevalent in, besides his own books, you know. And so Troy is going through this really hard thing where he's like, I hate myself as a person, and like, I have not been a good person my entire life. He kind of hid behind Dallas because he knows that he's gay. He was in a secret relationship for a really long time. And at the time that all of this stuff is going on, his boyfriend breaks up with him and then is engaged like a week later. So he's like, this guy was definitely cheating on me, and he never like wanted to come out with me. We were both keeping it a secret, and now I'm just left like feeling like this shitty person who was in love with someone that was cheating on me this whole time. And he feels awful that he like used his feeling like he needed to hide behind Dallas as a reason to ignore things that Dallas was doing. And he feels kind of guilty, like knowing that all of this stuff was happening on while he's friends with Dallas. So he's dealing with a lot of like self-hatred at the beginning of this book, and he gets traded to the Centaurs, and he like doesn't really care about being good. And he's like, they're all gonna hate me like as much as I hate myself. And really a lot of this book is him like coming to terms with the fact that even though he was ignoring shitty behavior, that doesn't mean that he's responsible for the shitty behavior, and he can try and offset that by like advocating for stuff and being a good person and becoming a safe space for people. So that's kind of his character growth throughout this book. And then his romantic interest is Harris, who's the social media manager for the team, and he's really sweet. And he's just like very encouraging of Troy the entire time. And I just thought that their relationship dynamic was really, really sweet. And I think that Troy goes through such tremendous character growth, and he's like such an unlikable character in Tough Guy, which is the only other book that he's in prior to this, because of the way that he kind of just like lets Dallas treat people like shit. And the fact that he grows so much in this book and becomes such a likable character by the end, and he is kind of like a safe space by the end of the book. I would say he is like the closest that Ilya comes to talking about his relationship with Shane is with Troy. And so I think the fact that like he becomes this person that Ilya is like trusts him, even though he knows that Shane wouldn't be okay with it, and so that's why he doesn't end up telling him, for the most part, in my opinion. But he becomes this person that like so many people trust, and his whole team loves him, and Harris is like the best guy on the planet, and Harris loves him. Like, I think his character growth is just incredible, and I think it's a really great way to write about how you can change hockey culture and everything like that, because, you know, he's pretty immersed in like being exactly what hockey culture wants hockey players to be like, and by the end of the book he is fully out and like fully speaking against all of the stuff that the league has been protecting and promoting and hiding. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed it, and I just love it. And I, of course, give a little bit of an extra enjoyment because Ilya's in it so much. And there's so much like little sneak peeks of what's to come in the long game in this book. So really, really enjoyed this one. And then finally, we have The Long Game, which is the second book of Shane and Ilya's. This is the last book that's out in the series right now. There is a new book coming out in September, which I will definitely be reading when it comes out, obviously. I gave this 4.5 stars. This really is such an interesting book because it is so much not about, none of the conflicts about these characters are about them getting together or them being together or like them admitting that they love each other like most romance books are. The whole conflict of this book is that they like don't know how to be a couple in public. Like they are both kind of like dealing with the mental stress of keeping this a secret all the time after they've admitted that they're in love with each other. In Heated Rivalry, they're a lot more comfortable keeping it a secret because they're kind of like in a situationship for the majority of that book. But at the end, you know, they finally admit that they love each other and all that kind of stuff. And so in this book, they're dealing with that. They're like, it was fine keeping this a secret when we were like both pretending like we weren't in love. But now that we're like admitting it to each other and we want to progress our relationship, but we can't really because we're still hiding, like it's taking a really big mental toll on both of them. And I just think the way that it explores that is really good. I will say, many people have said this before me. I think Shane is pretty underdeveloped in this book, and I think that is kind of sad. He is dealing with the same amount of stuff as Ilya, even though he is dealing with it in a less obvious way, I would say. And I think it's unfair to pretend like he's not dealing with the same stuff that Ilya is dealing with, just because he experiences everything in a different way because of how he is as a person. And Ilya is like very obviously dealing with depression for the entirety of the book, and that is discussed like very deeply and everything. But Shane also is like has an eating disorder this entire book, and it isn't talked about at all. I don't think that Rachel Reid realized that that's what she was like writing him as, but the reason that he's doing it is because he wants to have control over something. Like he doesn't have control over being out or being in a relationship publicly, and that kind of stuff. And the only thing that he has control over like is his food, and so he like goes overboard with that and is being like overly controlling of his food to try and like deal with the sadness that he's feeling and the anxiety over not having control in his life. And I think the fact that Rachel Reid didn't really realize that she was writing that and that it's also not explored at all is kind of disappointing. So that's my like biggest critique of this book, is that Shane is still a very a deep character, and the fact that it is not explored in the book is quite confusing to me. Um, but yeah, I think that this book has so many beautiful moments in it. And another book creator that I watch talked about how this book feels like fan fiction of Heated Rivalry in the best way. And I fully agree with that. Like, this book is not about outside conflicts hardly at all. It is just about the characters and their relationship, and like we're seeing them be in a relationship and like be happy and sad about the situation and growing together and falling more in love and growing up and doing all of these things. So I just really loved it. I think that the way that it examines their relationship is quite beautiful, and I think that their relationship is perfect and I love them so much. So I gave this 4.5 stars as well. So that is all 6 of them. In general, I think the series is pretty good, but I think it gets better as it goes on. The start is definitely a little rough. I think the exception to that is Heated Rivalry. I actually think Heated Rivalry is the best book in the series. Which is kind of crazy because it was the second book, but I think Heated Rivalry is the best. And then I think Role Model and Long Game are probably about equal for me. Long Game's maybe a little bit better just because I love that it's like fan fiction-y in style and it's just exploring the characters, and there's not really any outside conflict until pretty close to the end of the book. So maybe it's a little bit above Role Model, but I really love the way that the characters are done in Role Model and the character development. So those are about equal for me. And then Common Goal, and then I would say Game Changer and Common Goal are probably pretty equal for me in terms of enjoyment. I might actually enjoy the story of Game Changer more than Common Goal, but the writing is just so atrocious in that first book. I can't get over it. It's really bad. And then Tough Guy is probably my least favorite in the series, just because by the end I was like unsure of the relationship because of the way that the whole third act breakup was handled and everything. Even though I do really appreciate and understand what it was trying to do, I think that it failed a little bit in execution in the end. So that's my thoughts on all of them, and that is all of the books that I ended up reading in January. I'm going to rapid fire through my February TBR. For my physical TBR, I have not finished A Day of Fallen Night, which was the big book that I picked for my priority TBR for January, so I'm going to get through the rest of that. I've only read a little bit of it so far, but I'm liking what I'm reading so far, so I'm going to power through the rest of that. And then the other book on my physical TBR is Master of Djinn, and that is the book on my priority TBR that I'm picking for like actual February, even though I'm going to be reading both of them in February. So those are my two physical books. For my nonfiction TBR, I didn't finish Gates of Europe yet. I have it on audiobook. It is much more like not analysis than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be a little bit more insightful, but I'm not that far into it yet, so it might get more insightful in the later end of the book. But I'm going to finish that out, and then I'm reading The Will to Change in February by Bell Hooks. So I've started reading that. I'm about, I think, like 20% in. It's pretty short, so I'll definitely be able to finish that in February. And then besides those are for my nonfiction TBR. Gates of Europe is finishing out my January, and then The Will to Change is my February nonfiction book. For digital books, I'm going to read, I started it already, but I'm reading Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan, my first Kennedy Ryan book. And I started reading it. It's pretty good so far. I'm only like 10% in, but I like it so far. This is a second chance romance, so it does have a little bit of legwork to do for me, because like I said earlier in the video, I'm not always the biggest fan of second chance romances. I do think it can be done really, really well, though, because 7 Days in June is also a second chance romance, and that book is incredible. So we'll see if this one can pull past my usual side eye of second chance romances. But this is about two characters who they have kids together and they own businesses together, and they got divorced, but it's pretty obvious that they're still in love with each other, and they just like needed space away from each other to deal with their individual traumas. So we'll see how that relationship develops and if it beats out my second chance romance issues. And then as far as audiobooks, once I finish Gates of Europe, I am planning to listen to Lone Women and, gosh, what's the other one? Sorrowland by River Solomon. I didn't read any horror in January. I don't really count Slewfoot as horror, and I read the majority of that before January, so I didn't really read any horror in January, and I've been missing it a little bit, so my two audiobooks are both horror books. Sorrowland is a botanical horror, very like mushroom plant vibes, and Lone Women is a historical horror. That sounds really intriguing to me, so I'm going to try and listen to both of those and hopefully kick my audiobook slump. Possibly also I'll put these in my TBR because I might end up reading them. Probably will. We'll see. I have started playing Dragon Age Origins. I played Inquisition like 2 years ago, and I played Veilguard when it came out. So I've played those two, but I never played Origins or 2. And there are 6 books that are written about the Dragon Age characters and the universe. And so I was like, oh, I should try and read these like in order, because I'm also going to replay Inquisition and Veilguard. I'm going to like play the whole thing all the way through. So I was like, oh, I should read the books like chronologically. So I need to go back and read the first 2 because those are technically prequels to the first game. So I'm going to try and read those this month so that I can finish up Origins and then continue on with my games and that whole thing. So those are kind of like some little bonuses. I'll keep you updated on my progress through those throughout the months until I finish all of that up. And that, after so long, over an hour of talking, we'll see how short this gets edited down to. That is all of the books that I read in January and my February TBR. My next video will be my February reading journal setup. So that will be the next thing. And I'll see you soon for that one. But thanks very much for watching.